In the later Middle Ages, Scotland suffered from weak kings and powerful nobles. For 2 centuries, there was a constant struggle between the crown and the barons. Border clashes with England also continued. James IV of Scotland married Margaret, daughter of Henry VII of England, in 1503. When Henry VIII went to war with France in 1512, however, James IV invaded England. He fell, riddled with arrows, at Flodden Field in the last great border battle in 1513. James V died broken-hearted after his army had been slaughtered at Slowey Moss in 1542. The throne went to his infant daughter, Mary Stuart, Mary, Queen of Scots. Meanwhile, the Protestant Reformation had swept across Europe and into England. Scotland was still a Roman Catholic country. Its young queen, Mary Stuart, was in France when John Knox returned home to Scotland from Geneva, Switzerland. Knox was a follower of John Calvin, one of the leaders of the Reformation. With fiery eloquence, he spread Calvin's Protestant doctrine. Knox and others drove Mary out. In 1560, Scotland's Parliament adopted a confession of faith drawn up by Knox and established the Church of Scotland on a Presbyterian basis. When Mary returned to Scotland in 1561, she ruled the country successfully at first. However, 2 unsuccessful marriages and continual struggles with the Scottish nobles took their toll. She was imprisoned, then forced to abdicate her throne. She escaped, fled to England, where Queen Elizabeth I made her a prisoner and finally had her executed. Mary Stuart's son, James VI, was brought up as Presbyterian. When Queen Elizabeth of England died in 1603, James inherited the throne of England. In England, he was called James I. The 2 nations were thus united under a single king, but Scotland remained separate with its own parliament and government. England repeatedly tried to impose the Anglicans' episcopal form of worship and church government on the Scottish Kirk. The Scots took up arms against Charles I when civil war broke out in England. They aided the Puritans against the king. After Oliver Cromwell executed Charles I without consulting the Scots. However, the Scots welcomed Charles' son as Charles II. Cromwell then marched into Scotland and imposed his rule. When Charles II was restored to the throne, persecution of Presbyterians continued. Finally, after James II of England had been driven from the throne, Presbyterianism was firmly established as Scotland's national church. The 18th century became Scotland's most creative period, known as the Scottish Enlightenment. It made Edinburgh one of the intellectual powerhouses of Europe. David Hume won world fame in philosophy and history, Adam Smith in political economy, and Robert Burns in poetry. The next generation, Sir Walter Scott, made the land and the history of Scotland known throughout the world. During this period, the Scots were also preeminent in establishing the fledgling colonies in America, Canada, and Australia. In the 19th century, trade flourished with Scotland, importing tobacco, sugar, amongst other commodities. The spinning and weaving of cotton was an important industry, particularly in the west of the country, until the American Civil War cut off supplies almost overnight. Later, heavy industry flourished, including shipbuilding, locomotive building, and iron production. Glasgow became known as the second city of the empire, and for generations the term Clyde-built was synonymous for its industrial quality. When World War I broke out in 1914, Scots flocked to support the war effort, making up to 15% of the entire British Army. Also, warships were built on the Clyde and the ammunitions made in the south of the country. During the interwar years, many of the traditional heavy industries went into decline as the effects of the Depression were felt. Unemployment soared, with as many as 3 in 10 of the workforce being laid off, and it's thought that some 400,000 Scots chose to immigrate in search of new opportunities overseas during 1921 to 1931. Scottish industry got a boost during World War II with renewed demand for warship construction, aircraft engines, and ammunition. After the war, the Labour government introduced the National Health Service, which dramatically improved the health of the nation. In addition, urban regeneration cleared slums and created new housing estates with modern housing. By the 1970s, oil was discovered off the coast of Scotland, and a new industrial revolution started in the construction of oil rigs, refineries, support services. Aberdeen, on the east coast, became the oil industry capital, and a new sense of optimism permeated the country. In the post-war years, there has been an increasing call for more political independence for Scotland. In 1979, a referendum was held for the reintroduction of the Scottish Parliament. That vote was lost when a minimum number of votes required was not reached. When Tony Blair's Labour government gained power at Westminster in 1997, a further referendum was held. This time the vote succeeded, and the Scottish Parliament set for the first time in 300 years. A new Parliament building has been constructed close to the palace of the Holyrood House, which opened in 2004. In 2011, the Scottish National Party secured 69 of the 129 seats in the Scottish Parliament, giving it overall control. As a result, a referendum on Scotland's independence was negotiated with the Westminster government. The poll was held on 18 September 2014, with the result being 55.3% of the votes being against independence. The decision in June 2016 for the UK to leave the European Union has resulted in further calls for a second referendum on Scottish independence.